Shocking hidden footage from Buckingham Palace. Royal Guard uncovers the truth. Thomas Calder had walked the same halls of Buckingham Palace for almost 12 years, yet every single night felt slightly different to him. People believed that working as a royal guard was always the same, standing still, keeping watch, following rules, and repeating routines. But Thomas knew that the palace had a quiet personality of its own. Some nights felt warm and calm, like the building itself was resting. Other nights felt strange, as if something hidden behind the walls wanted attention. On this particular evening, the air carried an unusual stillness, one that Thomas sensed the moment he stepped into the grand hallway to begin his shift. He had arrived early, as he always did. Thomas believed punctuality was not just a rule. It was a way to show respect for the history and responsibilities of the palace. After checking in at the guard station, he adjusted his uniform and polished buttons, even though they already shined. He took a deep breath before stepping inside the long corridor that stretched toward the main residential wing. The floors beneath him were polished to a soft glow, reflecting the warm golden lights that lined the ceiling. Everything looked normal, perfectly normal, but his instincts whispered that something was slightly out of place. Thomas was not the type to ignore his instincts. His father, who served in the military, had always told him that a person's intuition was a quiet friend, one that should never be dismissed. So Thomas listened carefully to his surroundings, even though he heard nothing unusual. The security cameras blinked their tiny red lights. The antique clocks ticked softly. The evening breeze brushed the tall windows, making the curtains sway ever so slightly. A typical night, yet not quite. He continued forward, his shoes tapping gently against the floor. His route was simple: check each corridor, confirm each door latch, and make sure the palace remained safe and peaceful through the night. But tonight, something caught his eye before he had even finished the first hallway. The small service door near the library, one that was always locked and rarely used, was slightly open. Only by an inch, but enough that Thomas could clearly see the thin line of darkness inside. He stopped walking. That door had not been opened in months. It led to an old storage corridor that was rarely visited except for occasional repair work. Even then, workers always reported access ahead of time. Thomas had received no such notice. He looked around, expecting perhaps another guard or a staff member, but the hallway was empty. Thomas approached the door with calm steps, not wanting to jump to conclusions. Maybe someone had simply forgotten to close it properly. Mistakes happen. But deep down, he felt something else, something subtle but certain, that urged him to pay attention. When he reached the door, he touched the handle carefully and pushed it open a little wider. The hinges made a soft creak, the kind that echoed faintly through narrow spaces. Inside, the room was dark except for a faint, flickering glow coming from deeper within. It looked almost like the light of an old monitor. Thomas frowned. Why would anything be turned on in a room that no one used anymore? He looked behind him one more time to make sure everything outside the door was safe. Then he stepped inside. His footsteps became quieter on the old stone floor, and the air felt cooler. The room carried the scent of old paper, forgotten equipment, and the slight mustiness that comes from long periods without sunlight or fresh air. As he moved deeper, the flickering light grew brighter. It came from a doorway at the far end. Thomas's curiosity now grew stronger than his concern. As a guard, he was trained to handle unexpected situations calmly. He didn't panic. Instead, he let his sense of duty guide him forward. When he reached the second room, he pushed the door open gently. What he found inside surprised him completely. The room was filled with old security equipment. There were shelves stacked with tapes, dusty monitors, outdated switches, and thick cables that no longer served any purpose in the modern system. Thomas had heard stories from older guards about the palace's early camera systems, long replaced with advanced technology. But he had never actually seen the older room in use. Yet now, one of the monitors was turned on. Its screen glowed faintly, showing static lines across the surface. It looked fragile, as if it might shut off any moment. But the fact that it was on at all seemed unusual. There was no reason for old equipment like this to be powered, let alone active. Thomas stepped closer, studying the monitor carefully. There were small stacks of tapes beside it, each labeled with neat handwriting from decades ago. Some labels had faded, others were missing completely. He reached toward one but stopped himself. He needed to figure out why the room had come alive in the first place. He looked around for signs of someone else. A chair sat slightly pulled away from the desk. A thin layer of dust covered everything, yet the dust on the chair looked disturbed. Someone had been here recently, though it was impossible to tell when. His curiosity deepened. The palace was known for its long history, countless rooms, and hidden spaces. Some areas were rarely mentioned because they simply weren't part of daily operations. But it was unusual, very unusual, for a forgotten section to power itself on without explanation. Thomas decided to take a closer look at the monitor buttons, though he hesitated slightly. He didn't want to accidentally switch something off or trigger an alarm. But all he wanted was to understand why this equipment seemed active again. The screen flickered more clearly now, showing the outline of a hallway. It looked familiar, very familiar. Thomas realized it was a view from one of the old palace corridors, a part of the building that had been remodeled years ago. The modern system no longer used that angle, but the old camera had captured it decades before. Why would an old recording suddenly start playing? Thomas watched the grainy frame for several seconds, unsure what he expected to see. The hallway was empty, silent, and still. Yet something about the footage made him feel like he was witnessing a glimpse into a past he was never meant to see. He leaned closer just as a faint sound echoed behind him. He turned quickly, alert but calm. Nothing moved. The small storage corridor beyond the door remained still. Perhaps it had only been the settling of the old building, he thought. Buckingham Palace was ancient, full of echoes and shifting wood. Still, the timing made his pulse beat a little faster. He turned back to the monitor, but now the image on the screen had changed. The hallway was still visible, but something else appeared at the edge of the frame. A faint shadow. Not a person, not an object, but something that moved subtly, almost like a reflection. Thomas blinked, unsure whether the flicker was simply an old glitch. But before he could study it more closely, the screen flickered again. This time the static lines thickened and the image blurred, and then, just as suddenly as it had turned on, the monitor went dark. Thomas stared at the black screen for several seconds. The room felt even quieter now, as if the monitor had breathed its last bit of energy and fallen silent again. He stepped back slightly, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. Perhaps the equipment had malfunctioned. Old electronics sometimes powered on when wires shifted or circuits aged. There could be perfectly logical explanations. Yet Thomas couldn't ignore how strange the entire situation felt. The open door, the flickering monitor, the unusual timing, the brief strange shadow in the footage. None of it fit into the quiet, predictable order he usually experienced on night shifts. He took one more slow look around the room. Something told him that this space held more than what met the eye. There was a sense of mystery here, an unfinished story hidden among the dusty shelves and forgotten equipment. But he also knew he couldn't spend the whole night inside this room. He still had his shift to complete, and he needed to remain alert for the safety of the palace. Before leaving, Thomas gently closed the second door and then the first, making sure they were secure. He would report the unlocked door in his logbook, but he wasn't sure whether he should mention the odd monitor. Without clear evidence, it might sound like nothing more than a technical glitch. Yet the image of that faint shadow lingered in his mind. Thomas continued his rounds, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. The palace felt normal again, but he had the sense that he had just stepped into a story that had been waiting quietly for someone to notice it. He didn't know yet that this discovery would change everything. Thomas walked away from the old archive room, but his thoughts stayed behind. Every step he took seemed to echo louder than usual, as if the palace itself wanted him to think about what he had just seen. He tried focusing on the rest of his duties, but his mind drifted again and again to that strange, flickering monitor and the faint shadow that had appeared for just a second. By the time he finished checking the west corridor, curiosity had already taken firm hold of him. He knew he wouldn't be able to concentrate unless he returned to understand more, but he didn't turn back immediately. Thomas believed in discipline, and part of him felt he should finish his routine before investigating anything that wasn't officially part of his job. Still, the feeling in his chest, something between curiosity and quiet concern, made it difficult to ignore the pull of that old room. After completing the last part of his route, Thomas stood still for a moment, thinking carefully. The palace was stable, safe, and calm. No alarms had sounded, and nothing unusual appeared anywhere else. Everything was perfectly normal, except for what he had discovered earlier. And because of that, Thomas made a decision. He would go back. He didn't know why exactly. Something inside him whispered that there was more to uncover, something important, something hidden for a reason. So he returned to the narrow service hallway, the one with the slightly open door he had closed earlier. But when he reached it, the door was no longer closed. It was open again, just as it had been before. Thomas paused, his eyes fixed on the thin line of darkness behind the frame. This time, the door stood open even wider. That meant someone either came after he left or had never left to begin with, but he saw no one enter or exit. The palace corridors were open and long. It would be almost impossible for someone to walk past him unnoticed. He stepped closer. The temperature in that hallway felt slightly cooler than before, though he wasn't sure whether that was real or simply something he imagined. Very gently, he pushed the door and walked inside. The familiar dusty scent wrapped around him again. It felt like stepping into a forgotten memory. The faint glow inside the archive room was back. The monitor was on again. Thomas's heartbeat quickened, not in fear but in confusion. The equipment was old, very old. It should not have been turning itself on and off so easily. The palace technicians often joked that even unplugged machines here had a habit of switching back on, but those were just light-hearted comments. This felt different, too specific, too timed. He walked through the small walkway and entered the second room. The monitor flickered quietly, showing a dim hallway similar to the one he had seen earlier, except now the camera angle changed slightly. It was still old footage, unmistakably from decades past, but this time he could see a clearer view of the far end of the hall. The light in the footage felt softer than modern recordings. The shadows stretched differently, almost gently. Thomas watched it closely. Nothing moved. Everything seemed still. The scene played like a silent memory replaying itself just for him. He stepped closer and gently touched the edge of the table where the equipment rested. Dust lifted into the air, sparkling faintly in the monitor's glow. He looked at the shelves beside it again. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds of tapes here. Some were labeled carefully with dates and short descriptions like Main Corridor 1987 or Garden Entrance Routine. Others had no labels at all, only plain, faded surfaces. He wondered why they were stored here, separate from the main archive. He reached for one of the unlabeled tapes almost unconsciously, then stopped. He didn't want to disturb anything, not yet. He needed to first understand why the equipment was active at all. He leaned forward and looked at the buttons under the monitor. Some buttons were loose, some stiff from age. He hesitated, but finally pressed a small triangular button he assumed was for pausing or rewinding. The screen went black for a moment, then flickered back to life. Now he saw a different piece of footage, still the same hallway, but this time with slight movement in the corner. He squinted. The movement was small, very small, like the corner of a curtain being moved by a breeze. But indoor corridors at the palace didn't have open windows. That meant the curtain should not have been moving. He rewound a few seconds, watching the flicker again. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. He felt something warm spread through him, not fear, but a sense of mystery. He was witnessing something forgotten, something recorded long ago but never explained. And the question rose inside him. Why did no one mention this? Why was this room not sealed more securely if it contained old security material? He looked around more carefully this time. Cobwebs hung in the corners of the ceiling, untouched for years. The cables on the floor were stiff and old. The small desk lamp had no bulb. Everything screamed disuse, yet the equipment came alive as if awakening from a long sleep. The monitor flickered again. The slight movement appeared once more. Thomas felt the urge to lean even closer, almost holding his breath. But just as he focused, the scene suddenly jumped. It skipped ahead, showing a different time of day. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows in this scene. The brightness washed out the shadowy details, but Thomas could still make out the shapes of furniture and decorative pillars. The room in the footage was lively. Staff members walked past the camera. One person carried linens, another pushed a cart. Everything seemed ordinary, routine. Thomas felt almost relieved seeing normal activity. It proved that the camera had captured nothing more than daily palace life. But then he noticed something strange. The same staff member walked past twice, wearing the same clothes, carrying the same linens, taking the exact same steps. It wasn't two different moments. It was the same moment repeating. Thomas blinked, unsure if he had imagined it. He rewound a few seconds, watching again. The staff member passed once. Then immediately the same action repeated, like a loop. This meant the footage was not playing naturally. It had been edited or recorded incorrectly, or perhaps the tape had degraded and captured part of the scene twice. Technical issues like these were common with old tapes, he reminded himself. It didn't have to mean anything more, but something about the repetition felt off. Too precise, too exact, not a glitch, more like a deliberate rewind that only played one action again. Thomas stepped back slightly and exhaled. He suddenly realized how deeply he had become absorbed in the footage. The palace had always been full of stories. Tour talked about hidden rooms, secret doors, and long-lost corridors, but guards rarely experienced anything that felt mysterious. Most nights were quiet, predictable, and uneventful. This night felt different. He tried to recall whether he had ever heard about this archive room from supervisors or senior guards. Surely someone must have mentioned it before, or at least explained why it existed. But Thomas couldn't remember a single conversation about it. And that bothered him more than anything else. Why did no one talk about a room so filled with historic security material? He looked over the tapes again. One tape in particular caught his eye. It had a handwritten label that read, "Restricted, do not view." The ink had faded, but the words were still readable. Thomas did not touch it. He didn't even reach toward it. But seeing the label made the air feel heavier somehow. He wondered whether the monitor would eventually start showing footage from that tape. The idea made him uneasy, not because he feared anything troubling, but because he sensed this room held stories that were meant to stay hidden. Still, the mystery drew him in. He sat down slowly on the old wooden chair, surprised that it still supported weight. Dust puffed up around him. He adjusted himself, then stared at the monitor again. He pressed another button, hoping it would continue the recording naturally. Instead, the screen went blank for several seconds. A soft, humming sound filled the room. The monitor was trying to display something, but the tape inside must have been struggling after years of not being played. Thomas waited patiently. He wasn't in a hurry. The palace was calm, and he could spare a few minutes to understand what this archive was trying to show him. Finally, the screen lit up again. This time, the footage showed a completely different room, a large one, a room Thomas recognized immediately. It was one of the old lounges that had been redesigned recently. The modern version looked bright and elegant, but the archived version looked simpler, less decorated, but warm in its own way. Thomas could see people walking in and out, chatting, carrying papers, arranging furniture. It looked like a day of preparation for an event, probably years ago. Everyone in the scene appeared busy and focused. But then he noticed something else. One person in the footage stood completely still. While the others moved naturally, this person stood near the corner, facing the wall, not moving at all. At first, Thomas assumed they were simply waiting for instructions or maybe examining the wall for maintenance work. But after several seconds, when everyone else continued their tasks, this person still did not move. The camera angle didn't show their face, only the back. They wore plain clothes, not a staff uniform, and that small detail stood out to Thomas. Staff members always wore proper attire during work hours. Plain clothing meant this person was not staff. And if not staff, then who? He leaned closer, studying the shape and posture. The person in the footage looked calm, almost too calm, as if completely separated from the activity around them. Then, as if sensing something, the person turned slightly, not fully, but enough that Thomas could see their side profile. He felt a small shiver, not fear, but deep curiosity. Something about the expression looked thoughtful, almost aware of being observed. But this was impossible. The footage was decades old. No one in an old video could sense anything in the present. Still, the moment felt strange. Gentle but strange. After a few more seconds, the screen flickered again and the footage changed. The lounge disappeared, replaced by static. The monitor dimmed and brightened twice, then shut off completely. Thomas sat in silence, the quiet hum of the palace surrounding him. He knew now that this archive room was not just a forgotten space. It held pieces of history, real events, real people, real moments captured long ago. But it also held small mysteries that slipped through the cracks of time. Repeated scenes, unexplained movements, and people who appeared out of place. He stood slowly, brushing the dust from his trousers. He didn't want to disturb anything else tonight. He had seen enough to know that this room deserved a deeper look, but not rushed, not without care. He took one last look at the shelves. The tapes remained lined up quietly, each one waiting with its own story. Some stories normal, others perhaps unusual. And somewhere among them, Thomas sensed something important, something someone had once chosen to hide. As he stepped out of the room and gently closed the door, he felt a calm determination settling inside him. He knew he would return again, not out of fear or duty, but because the truth inside those tapes was calling to him, quietly, patiently inviting him to uncover it piece by piece. He walked back into the main corridor, the bright palace lights greeting him as if nothing unusual had happened. But Thomas knew better. Tonight, he had opened a door into a forgotten world, and he was ready to discover what waited next. Thomas returned to his normal duties, but the old archive room stayed in his thoughts like a quiet whisper that refused to fade. Every time he walked past the grand windows or checked a hallway, his mind drifted back to the flickering monitor, the looping staff member, the still figure in the lounge, and the strange way the door had opened on its own twice. Buckingham Palace had always been a place of routines, traditions, and steady calm. But now, Thomas felt as if he had stepped into a secret chapter of the building, one that few people knew existed. That night he tried to act normal and follow his usual responsibilities, but even the sound of his own footsteps seemed different to him. The palace felt the same, yet he could not stop feeling that somewhere behind the decorated walls, something unseen was happening. Not dangerous, just hidden. When the clock reached the middle of his shift, he paused at the far end of a long hallway. The lights cast a warm glow across the floor and everything was perfectly still. He listened quietly, nothing unusual, and yet his curiosity grew stronger. He felt a gentle pull, almost like an invitation, encouraging him to return to the archive room and continue what he had started. He had a decision to make. Should he follow his regular patrol without interruption, or should he try to understand why the old tapes were still playing after decades of silence? After a moment of thought, he turned toward the service hallway again. He walked slowly, not out of fear, but to give himself time to think. He replayed the images in his mind, the flickering camera, the strange shadow, the repeating staff scene, and the person standing still in the corner of the lounge. None of it made clear sense yet, but everything felt like pieces of a larger story waiting to be uncovered. As he approached the narrow hallway, he expected to see the door slightly open again. But this time, the door was fully closed and tightly shut. No light peeked from the edges. Everything looked completely normal. Thomas reached for the handle. It was cold to the touch. He turned it slowly. The door opened with a gentle creak, and the familiar darkness welcomed him. The air inside the old corridor felt slightly cooler than before, but still calm. He stepped in carefully, closing the door behind him to avoid causing any unnecessary attention. When he reached the inner room, he froze in surprise. The monitor was already on. It showed a shaking image, as if the tape had just started. The picture settled after a moment, and Thomas saw something unexpected. It was not the hallway or lounge he had seen earlier. The footage now showed a long, narrow corridor he had never seen before, not in the modern palace, and not in any old photographs he could remember. This hallway looked simple, almost plain. The walls were undecorated. The lighting was softer than the golden palace lamps. For a moment, Thomas wondered whether this footage belonged to the palace at all, or to another building captured long ago. He moved closer, studying every small detail. At first glance, nothing unusual happened in the footage. The hallway remained empty, calm, and quiet. But then something subtle caught his eye. A small door at the very end of the hallway trembled slightly as if touched by a gentle breeze. But the hallway in the footage had no windows, no open spaces. Why would the door move? Thomas leaned forward. Suddenly, the door in the footage opened just a crack. Nothing entered or left. The space behind the door remained too dark to see anything. But the door stood there, open just enough to send a small shiver of curiosity through him. He wondered if this was the same door he himself had seen earlier, the one that kept opening on its own without explanation. Could the footage be showing a part of the same forgotten section of the palace? He wasn't sure. He pressed a button to rewind the tape slightly and watched again. The door remained still for several seconds. Then, as before, it slowly shifted open. The moment was subtle, yet the timing felt intentional. Not forced, not alarming, just quietly mysterious. He watched the tape again, this time looking at the floor. He noticed something he hadn't seen before, faint shadows that appeared for only a second, then faded. They seemed too soft and too quick to belong to people. Maybe the tape was old and the light had faded in parts. But the movement felt strangely natural, like something passing by without sound. Thomas sat down slowly. He didn't feel uneasy. Instead, he felt as if he was getting closer to understanding something not harmful but hidden through time. The tape continued. The scene changed again, fading into a new location. The next image revealed a small sitting room, furnished simply with wooden chairs and a desk. The camera angle showed the corner of a window, and Thomas could see that the sunlight in the footage looked warm and gentle, as if the recording had taken place on a calm morning many years ago. A person entered the room quietly, someone wearing a staff uniform from decades earlier. They carried a small stack of papers, placed them neatly on the table, and sat down. Nothing unusual. They looked focused on their work. But then something unexpected happened. The person suddenly looked directly at the camera. Thomas blinked. People didn't normally look at old security cameras, especially not the ones hidden discreetly in the corners. Yet the person stared at the camera as if they knew exactly where it was. Their expression was calm, almost peaceful. They didn't frown or smile. They simply looked. For several long seconds, the person held that quiet gaze. Then, as if finished with a thought, they turned back to their papers and continued working. Thomas felt his heart lift slightly with curiosity. There was nothing scary or alarming about the moment. It just felt unusual, meaningful somehow, like the person wanted to be seen across time, even if they didn't fully understand it themselves. He leaned closer and studied the timestamp on the corner of the footage. It was barely readable, faded with age. But he could make out the year. It was indeed many decades old, long before Thomas had even been born. He wondered what the person had been working on. Why they looked at the camera, whether they were thinking about something important. He wished he could understand more, but the footage offered no sound, only silent motion. The tape moved to another scene. Now Thomas saw a room he recognized well, the East Gallery, but in a much older form. The paintings were arranged differently. The furniture was placed in simpler formations. A soft runner rug covered the floor, something not present in the modern setup. It felt like watching a living memory. In the footage, two staff members walked side by side, talking with friendly gestures. They seemed cheerful, perhaps discussing preparations for an event or sharing an amusing story. Their expressions were relaxed and natural. Thomas watched their movements with quiet interest, feeling as though he had traveled back in time. Then he saw it again. Near the far corner, a faint figure stood still, not sharply visible, just a silhouette, soft, almost blurred. The figure seemed to be observing the room, but did not move closer or interact with anyone. Thomas blinked several times, unsure if the shadow was simply part of the lighting in the old footage. Sometimes, aged tapes created unclear shapes. He had seen enough archive documentaries to know that imperfections frequently appeared. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this particular shape had appeared in earlier tapes too. He tried to rewind the footage again, but the tape resisted and made a low clicking sound. He stopped immediately, not wanting to damage anything. He didn't need to see the moment again to know that something consistent was happening. There were patterns in the recordings, small details, repeated shapes, quiet movements, that hinted at a story the archive had been holding for years. Thomas stood and stretched his legs. Sitting too long made him stiff, and he wanted to keep his senses sharp. As he took a slow breath, he noticed something new. The shelves of tapes now seemed more meaningful. Before, they looked like simple old recordings waiting to be sorted or forgotten. Now, each tape felt like a window into the past. And somewhere among these windows, he believed a full story connected them all. He reached out and picked up a labeled tape this time. The handwriting said East Wing Review Copy. It felt smooth in his hands. He placed it back gently, not yet ready to open a new chapter. The monitor flickered again, going briefly dark before lighting up with another scene. This time, it showed a different part of the palace Thomas knew well, but once again from decades earlier. The walls had different wallpaper, the carpets were patterned instead of plain, and the chandeliers hanging from above looked slightly smaller and simpler. What caught Thomas's attention wasn't the room this time. It was a sound, not from the footage. The footage had no audio. But from the archive room itself, a soft clicking sound echoed behind him. He turned slowly. The sound came from the corner shelf. A small tape had shifted slightly out of place, like it had slipped a fraction of an inch forward. Thomas approached it with steady steps. Perhaps the shelf was uneven. Perhaps it was just the wood adjusting to the building's temperature. Old buildings often made small noises. Still, it happened exactly when the tape changed scenes, which made Thomas feel that the room was somehow responding to his attention. He touched the tape gently and pushed it back into place. The moment felt normal enough, but he couldn't ignore the strange timing. When he turned back toward the monitor, the footage had shifted again. The camera now showed a place Thomas recognized instantly, the long hallway leading to the former gallery area. But something made this footage completely different. Someone was walking down the hallway, but their steps were almost too soft, barely making the camera shake. Their figure was not sharp, almost like the light didn't catch them fully. They moved smoothly, calmly, as though they were simply gliding rather than walking, not rushed, not stressed, just moving with purpose. Thomas watched closely. The person reached the end of the hallway, paused, and turned slightly. Even though the image was unclear, Thomas sensed they were looking toward the camera. Not directly, just slightly angled. But enough to give the scene a strange feeling of awareness, as if the person somehow understood they were being recorded. The figure then moved through a side door. The door closed slowly behind them. Thomas waited for the camera to continue showing the hallway, expecting something else to appear or someone else to enter. But the footage ended abruptly. The screen turned to soft gray static for several seconds, then went black. He waited. Nothing returned. He pressed the button again, still nothing. The monitor had turned off. Thomas exhaled slowly and rubbed the back of his neck. He didn't feel frightened. Whatever he had seen wasn't threatening or alarming. It wasn't harmful. It felt more like the palace sharing its memories, soft, mysterious, and quietly intricate. He now understood something clearly. The recordings weren't random. They were connected, and the strange figure appearing in multiple tapes might not be a person at all. It might be a shadow created by old light, a shape caused by damaged film, or something entirely symbolic that only existed because time had aged these tapes strangely. Whatever the explanation, Thomas felt drawn to learn more. He stepped out of the chair and looked around the archive room once more. The dust-covered shelves, the old boxes, the quiet monitor, all of it seemed to hum with a hidden story waiting patiently to be discovered. Thomas knew he was not done. He would return again. And each time he felt, the palace would reveal a little more. Thomas left the archive room later than he expected. Even though the palace was calm and silent, his mind felt full, almost too full, as if he had viewed an entire book of stories in only a few minutes. As he returned to the main hall, he walked slowly, thinking about every detail he had seen. The drifting figure, the old rooms, the person who looked directly at the camera, the quiet hallway door opening by itself. None of it made clear sense yet, but everything felt connected. He tried to continue his regular duties, checking doors, inspecting windows, and making sure each corridor remained safe. But even as he carried out his tasks, the memory of the tapes followed him like a soft echo. Thomas was a calm person by nature. Nothing usually unsettled him, but tonight his curiosity worked quietly inside him like a gentle tug. He wasn't frightened, only fascinated. Something important hid behind those dusty tapes, and some part of him believed that the palace had chosen this moment, this night, to reveal it. When he finished his patrol and returned to the guard station for a log update, he hesitated. Should he write about the old archive room? Should he mention the monitor switching on and off? Should he report the unusual tape footage? He looked at the blank page of the logbook. If he wrote anything, someone might think he misunderstood routine electronic glitches. The equipment was old. Things like this happened in old buildings. But Thomas knew in his heart that this was more than that. Still, he decided not to write about the tapes yet, not until he understood them better. He closed the logbook gently, placed it back on the desk, and stepped outside the station. He walked through the main corridor again, listening quietly. The palace had a peaceful rhythm at night, a gentle stillness that made every sound important. Guards often said that the palace at night felt like a different world, quieter, softer, almost thoughtful. Tonight, the building felt even more aware than usual, as if it were holding its breath. Thomas reached the long east hallway and stopped. Something subtle had changed. The lighting felt a little dimmer than before, not enough to alarm anyone, but enough for someone with his experience to notice. He looked up. One of the lamps seemed to be glowing slightly less bright. It was nothing unusual. Light sometimes dimmed with age. but at this moment it caught his attention more than it normally would. Then he heard a faint sound behind him, a soft click. He turned calmly. It wasn't a sharp noise, not startling or loud, just a gentle click like a door latch settling. He took a few steps toward the sound and realized it came from a small maintenance door at the far end of the hallway. This door was supposed to remain locked. It was rarely used, usually kept secure unless workers needed to access pipes or wiring. Thomas approached it slowly. He touched the handle gently and discovered it was slightly loose. But when he pushed, the door didn't open. It was still firmly locked. He stepped back again. It was probably nothing, he told himself. Old metal, old hinges, natural settling. It could create sounds easily. Yet the timing of the click reminded him of how the archive door had opened on its own earlier. For a moment, he wondered whether the palace was guiding him, showing him pieces of a story through small movements and gentle signs. He took a breath, turned, and continued down the hallway. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had left a trail for him to follow. Hours passed quietly, and soon it was time for Thomas to take a short break. Guards rotated in pairs, and during breaks he typically sat near the window in the West Gallery, a place where he liked to rest his mind for a few minutes. The gallery was empty at night, filled with paintings and artifacts that seemed to watch over the halls silently. Thomas always felt peaceful here. Tonight, however, that peacefulness came with a new kind of awareness. He sat down on the bench near the window and looked at the moonlit garden below. Everything looked calm. The trees swayed gently. The flowers glowed softly in the moonlight. The palace roof reflected the silver sky. But as Thomas looked more closely, he saw something unusual. Near the lower garden path, a small light flickered. Not bright, like a flashlight, just a faint shimmer as if a reflection had appeared where no reflective surface existed. It lasted only a second, then it disappeared. Thomas blinked. The garden path was empty. The benches were empty. Nothing moved. He leaned forward, trying to catch another glimpse of the light, but it didn't return. Still, the moment brought a question to his mind. Was the flicker connected to what he saw in the tapes? He stood slowly. He wasn't the kind of person who ignored patterns. Something inside him told him that all these quiet signs pointed toward the same hidden truth. He decided he needed help, not someone who would dismiss his observations, not someone who would laugh at the idea of old tapes playing themselves. He needed someone experienced and open-minded, someone he trusted. So he walked to the North Station, where Officer Daniel Hart usually worked during night shifts. Daniel was older, kinder than most, and had served in the palace even longer than Thomas. He was patient, thoughtful, and always believed there was more to the palace than what visitors saw. When Thomas reached the station, he found Daniel reading through maintenance reports. Daniel looked up and smiled warmly. "Long night?" he asked gently. Thomas nodded. "Different," he replied quietly. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" Thomas paused. He didn't want to sound unsure or confused, but Daniel waited calmly, giving him space to gather his thoughts. Finally, Thomas spoke. He kept his voice low and steady. "I found an old archive room, the one behind the library hallway." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, I know it. Not many guards mention it anymore. It's been unused for years." Thomas felt relief. At least Daniel knew the room existed. That made him feel less alone. Daniel studied his expression. "Did something happen there?" Thomas explained everything. The open door, the monitor turning on by itself, the strange footage, the repeating scenes, the quiet figure, and the people looking toward the camera. He described how the archive seemed to awaken whenever he entered, how tapes shifted slightly, how scenes felt purposeful, almost guiding. Daniel didn't interrupt. He listened quietly, his expression calm and thoughtful. When Thomas finished speaking, Daniel leaned back and folded his hands. "Thomas," he said softly, "this palace is old, very old, you know that. Rooms like that one hold years of memories, and sometimes memories leave impressions, little marks of time." Thomas felt encouraged. Daniel wasn't dismissing anything. "I've seen strange things too," Daniel admitted. "Not harmful, not frightening, just unusual. The palace has ways of reminding us of its past." Thomas looked at him with curiosity. Daniel smiled faintly. "I've never seen the tapes play by themselves," he continued, "but I've heard stories from guards who worked years before us. They said the old equipment sometimes turned on without reason, not because of people, but because time has its own rhythm in these walls." Thomas took in every word. Daniel's calm explanation comforted him, but it also deepened his curiosity. "What do you think I should do?" Thomas asked quietly. Daniel looked at him thoughtfully. "If the palace is showing you something," he said gently, "then maybe it trusts you to understand it. You don't need to rush. Let the story reveal itself, but be careful. Not everything hidden is meant to be brought into the open." Thomas nodded slowly. He thanked Daniel and walked back into the hallway, replaying Daniel's words in his mind. He felt more certain now. The palace wasn't trying to frighten him, it was guiding him. He returned to the archive room once more. This time, as he approached the door, he noticed something new. The faint glow under the door was brighter than before, as if the monitor was waiting for him. He opened the door and stepped inside. The monitor wasn't flickering now. It displayed a steady image, clearer than any he had seen earlier. It showed the same long hallway as before, but now the camera angle revealed something new. At the far end stood a small table. On top of the table sat a book, a thick book with a dark cover. The footage zoomed slightly, as if the camera wanted him to notice the book. Thomas leaned closer. The book looked old, its corners slightly curved from time, but something about it looked familiar, like he had seen it in one of the palace exhibitions or inside a storage catalog. The tape continued playing. A person entered the hallway slowly, walked toward the table, and placed a small object beside the book. The camera didn't show the person's face clearly, but their movements were calm and deliberate. Thomas noticed they handled the book with great care, almost reverence. After placing the object on the table, they stepped back and disappeared from the frame. The camera stayed focused on the book. Thomas felt his curiosity intensify. Why was the camera showing him this book? What did it represent? And why did the footage change so smoothly, almost as if it wanted him to understand something specific? He watched for several more minutes before the screen faded softly into static. He stood in silence, thinking, feeling the puzzle pieces shifting into new shapes. Someone had placed the book there on purpose, years ago. Someone who wanted it to be remembered, and the palace, in its own quiet way, was showing it to him. Thomas stepped back from the monitor and looked around the room once more. He noticed something he hadn't seen earlier, a small wooden box tucked behind the lowest shelf, covered in dust, barely visible. As if it had been waiting, he walked toward it slowly. Was this connected to the book in the footage? Was this the next clue? Thomas reached out, gently brushing dust from the lid. The box felt old but solid, like it held something meaningful. And as he prepared to open it, he knew one thing for certain. The palace wasn't showing him the past by accident. It was inviting him deeper into the truth. Thomas stood in front of the small wooden box, his breath slow and steady. The room felt even quieter than before, as if the walls themselves were watching him. Dust floated gently in the air, settling slowly on the shelves and tapes around him. He reached out and touched the box again, running his fingers across its smooth but aged surface. It felt solid, heavier than it looked, and even though it was covered in dust, he could sense that whatever was inside had been preserved carefully. He hesitated for a moment, not out of fear, but out of respect. He had spent the whole night uncovering quiet memories hidden in tapes and old rooms. Each one had shown him pieces of a story that had never been written down or spoken aloud. Now, this box felt like the final piece, a part of the puzzle the palace wanted him to see. With gentle hands, Thomas lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in thin cloth that had yellowed with age, was a small book. Not a thick one, like the one in the footage, but still old enough to carry the scent of time. It looked simple, no decorations, no shiny patterns, just a soft leather cover. He touched it lightly. The leather felt smooth, warmer than he expected. Thomas slowly unwrapped the cloth and opened the book. The first page had neat handwriting, old handwriting with careful curves and soft lines. It belonged to someone who had written each letter with intention. The ink had faded gently but was still readable. Thomas lowered his gaze and began to read. The book was a kind of journal. It wasn't a diary filled with personal secrets. Instead, it contained records of daily palace life from many decades earlier. Short entries written by a staff member who had once worked in these same halls. The entries described preparations for events, small notes about changes in furniture arrangements, observations about lighting in certain corridors, and comments about routine tasks. Thomas turned the pages slowly, almost reverently. The journal wasn't about dramatic moments or shocking events. It was about quiet details, ones most people would never pay attention to. But as Thomas read, he understood something important. The writer had loved the palace deeply. Their words were filled with affection for the history, the architecture, and the peaceful rhythm of the rooms. As Thomas turned another page, he found something that made him pause. One entry mentioned the old recording room behind the library hall, the same archive room he had discovered. The writer described how important it was to preserve footage for future staff to understand how the palace operated. They wrote about placing tapes carefully, about categorizing scenes, and about keeping the equipment safe so that future generations could remember the past. Thomas felt warmth spread through his chest. This journal belonged to someone who had taken their work seriously. Someone who understood that history is made not only through grand events, but through daily routines and small choices. He turned the page again. Another entry caught his attention. The writer described a moment when they felt the palace was speaking through its old rooms. Not with words, but with small signs, shifting light, unexplained reflections, a quiet sense of presence. They believed the palace carried memories that never faded, even when the people who filled it moved on. As Thomas read, he felt comforted. He wasn't imagining things. Someone else, long before him, had also sensed this gentle awareness in the building. He continued reading. Entry after entry described peaceful interactions, moments of calmness, and the writer's observations about how the palace seemed to hold stories without ever revealing them all at once. Then, near the end of the journal, Thomas found something that made him stop completely. The writer described placing a second, larger book on a hallway table, the same book Thomas saw in the footage. According to the entry, the book contained important notes about restoration plans, room histories, and artwork details. The writer believed future staff might need it someday. They hoped it would be found when the time was right. Thomas felt a gentle shiver of realization. The palace had chosen him to find it, not because he was special in any dramatic way, but because he cared enough to listen. He respected the building and treated every hallway with attention. The palace trusted him with its stories. He closed the journal softly and placed it back in the box, wrapping it again with the cloth. He didn't want to disturb its contents further. He wanted to honor the writer, whoever they were, for preserving these quiet memories. As he stood, he noticed the monitor behind him flicker once more. He turned slowly. The screen lit up with a gentle glow, softer than ever. No scene appeared this time. No hallway, no figure, no forgotten room, just a warm, steady light. It felt like a goodbye. As if the palace was telling him that he had seen enough for now, that the story had reached its peaceful end. Thomas watched the glow for a moment, feeling a calm satisfaction settle inside him. He felt grateful. Grateful for the past, grateful for the people who had cared for the palace before him, and grateful for the chance to understand something meaningful and quiet. The monitor slowly dimmed, as if taking one last breath, then turned off completely. Thomas stood in silence. He looked around the archive room once more. The shelves still held countless tapes, each one its own memory. The room felt different now, not mysterious or confusing, but familiar, safe, calm, like he had stepped into a place that finally trusted him. He bent down and lifted the small wooden box. It was light in his hands. He knew he couldn't just leave it on the floor. It needed to be kept somewhere safe, not hidden but respected, remembered. He carried the box out of the archive room, closing the door behind him gently. This time the door stayed closed without shifting. As Thomas walked through the service hallway, he felt a sense of closure settling into the air. He had not uncovered a scandal or danger. He had not witnessed anything alarming. What he found was something far more meaningful, a piece of the palace's heart. He stepped back into the brightly lit corridor. Everything felt normal again. The lights shone steadily. The carpets lay perfectly flat. The polished floors reflected the warm glow of the lamps. The palace felt peaceful, almost proud. Thomas walked back to the guard station, carrying the box with both hands. When he entered, Daniel looked up from his paperwork. "What do you have there?" Daniel asked gently. Thomas placed the box on the desk. "A journal," he replied quietly. "It explains the tapes." "It explains everything." Daniel leaned forward, curious but patient. He opened the lid and examined the book with care. "A piece of history," Daniel whispered, smiling softly. "A quiet one," Thomas nodded. It felt like the palace wanted someone to find it. Daniel looked at him with warm understanding. "Then it chose the right person." Thomas felt a gentle warmth spread through his chest at those words. Not pride, just gratitude. For the first time in years, he felt truly connected to something bigger than his role. Bigger than the routines, bigger than the long corridors and the patrol routes. He felt connected to the story of the palace itself. The rest of the night passed smoothly. Thomas continued his rounds with a lighter heart. The palace felt brighter somehow, and as he walked through the halls, he felt a quiet companionship in the air, as if the building walked with him. When the early morning light finally touched the windows, Thomas stood by the east gallery and watched the golden rays spill into the hallway. The sunrise felt like a soft curtain lifting, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. He knew he would never see the palace the same way again. He had found its gentle secrets, its quiet truths. And even though he didn't know what the future held, he felt certain that he would continue discovering more, not through old tapes or forgotten rooms, but through the simple act of paying attention. He took one last look at the peaceful morning light and smiled softly. The palace had trusted him with its memories, and Thomas would honor that trust for the rest of his service.